You know, that's pretty amazing to me in some regards, that something could last for 17,000 years and still hold up as well as it does. But that's one of the benefits of doing these things in caves. In fact, some of the caves, the Lascaux cave system is a really huge cave system in itself. There are whole rooms in there that have nothing but handprints on the wall. And I was just reading an article about this that's really interesting. It was talking about how some of those handprints were done by women, which is an interesting concept because we usually consider that, you know, most of these societies were patriarchal societies, meaning that they were run by men, but they believe now that a lot of these cave paintings were actually conceived and done by women based upon those handprints that they're finding on the walls. Somehow they can judge, there's some difference in the way that women's hands are formed versus men's hands, and that's how they came to that conclusion. In any case, we talked about two terms that came up with this depiction that we saw the other day. Does anybody remember what those two terms were? Two words? Yes.
Pictogram and ideogram.
Good. Does anybody know what a pictogram is? What would you define a pictogram as, Jessica?
A pictogram that means something.
Okay.
It like shows a certain object saying, hey, this is that.
Okay. Can anybody think of a pictogram that we see used all the time?
An emoji.
In society today?
An emoji.
An emoji is sort of a
I don't know.
pictogram. Yeah. Anybody else? What else?
Signs, like road signs.
Yeah, road signs are a really good example of pictograms. So they depict something that we recognize. Like take the women's room signs, women's room, men's room, those are pictograms. So we understand that that figure is not an exact likeness of a person, but there's enough information there that we put together the image of the thing that it's supposed to be. So what's an ideogram? The other word that we talked about. Yes?
A drawing of an abstract thought, like happiness would be a smile or something like that.
Okay, that's an example. Anybody else have an example of an ideogram? Something that's a complex thing. It doesn't necessarily represent a word, it represents an idea.
The Rorschach test?
That's
a joke.
Yeah, but there's not an icon that really kind of represents it. I'm talking about icons or a symbol of some sort that represents a whole concept, a whole idea.
Or like pi or something?
Like the skull and crossbones would represent that.
Very
Okay.
good, very good. That's a good
I was thinking like pi.
Yeah, pi is
Okay.
a good one for, you know, the
Mathematical.
the Greek figure of pi, the skull and crossbone, religious symbols like the Christian cross would definitely represent an ideogram. So those are a couple of terms that we've talked about here. The other thing that we brought this up to talk about, among other things, the idea of the whole concept of being able to communicate and talk to each other and not just rely upon pictograms and not just thinking that these folks were having very rudimentary one word or two syllable word conversations with each other, but having actually complex thoughts is the development or the visuals of ideograms that show up on here, or what we think are ideograms. They don't look like a thing that we can recognize today. Perhaps these are representative of arrows or darts of some sort, but that thing that's above does not resemble anything that we can really imagine being used today. So we think that they perhaps were trying to communicate some deeper concept with each other in these communications. We also know this because if we think about like Native Americans, when Columbus and all the rest of those guys were coming to America, they encountered tribes that were here that had communication skills with each other. They had their own languages. They didn't necessarily write them down, but they could certainly communicate back and forth with each other and express complex thoughts and complex ideas. So we know that we're not limited in our communication abilities to just writing. In fact, we use our oral conversations far more than we use written conversation. But this is the first time when we actually see written communication starting to happen. So we know that these folks were actually pretty complex. They probably had as sophisticated thoughts as we have today, which is, again, something that kind of blows people's minds away when they start to think about, oh, okay, these guys were having real conversations. They were probably making jokes with each other and whatever. But again, one of the other things I want to point out here is something that we call a substrate. What's a substrate? Somebody?
And that the material,
And so the substrate here was what?
Stone and ash.
Yeah, stone walls, that was the substrate, the surface on which they were writing. So they were using charcoals, they were using pigments and ores that they were digging out of the ground to create the ink that they were, or the material that they were writing on these stone walls, but the stone wall itself was the substrate. Today we have digital formats that we work with, but we haven't always had digital formats. So what other kinds of substrates can we think of that existed, that's somewhere between stone walls and this?
Smoke signals.
Okay, so
Kind of
signals.
Papyrus.
Papyrus, good, what else?
paint,
Paint is a material that you use, but they didn't paint on paint.
Courier
So-
pigeon.
So what is the surface that they were writing on? Yes,
Stone.
Jessica?
Clay tablets.
Tablets, clay tablets, very good, yeah. Anybody else? What do you think? Paper, okay, yes. Canvas, very good, it's a cloth.
They had leather back then or not yet?
Yeah, sure, if you can get an animal and carve its skin off of his body, you can make leather. Anybody else have ideas back here? I can't remember what your name is. Your name is Taylor. Taylor, any ideas? No? Anybody else? Go ahead, Jessica.
Trees.
Trees, wood, yeah. So we can think about all the things that you could write on. You could write in the dirt. That's a substrate also, but not permanent, and you can't carry it around. So the thing that really became important for people, and the thing that made it difficult for these guys to communicate beyond, these caves that, of course, are holding up 17,000 years ago, is that you can't pick up an entire stone wall and carry it around with you. So that made the folks that were doing this have to come back to those caves over and over again if they were going to use this as a learning device. But then they started to figure out ways that they could start to make this idea portable, that they could carry around their written words and make it available to themselves. Now, just before we go into this idea of papyrus making, just a quick step forward from those guys that were doing stuff in caves to the point where they started to become portable, or what was happening. Anybody have any ideas why men moved out of caves and started to become more mobile? What do you think?
Find food.
Yes, Jessica.
Gather food. Right.
If we're still the hunter-gatherer, then to find more resources, but in farmers, the land could no longer become fertile, so they would have to move to different places in order to farm better.
So like,
And plus, closer to water equals easy access to water.
All those things that you have to think about.
so it's like before the Egyptians, like agricultural revolution. So it's like, oh god.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we go through all of these cycles
Fertile
of
Crescent, all
man's development. They go from this time period where they're writing on stone walls to the time when they start to form agricultural societies. Here's another question for you, just a question for you. Which came first, the metal or the wheel?
Wheel.
She says
Well, it's like
wheel.
it's like a
Anybody
chicken or the
else
egg.
differ from that?
It's a trick question. It's like a chicken or the egg.
No, it's not.
Oh really? Okay, I thought it was like because like well,
No, it's not.
well if you do the
same
fit.
time.
Nope.
Well, the thing is that you need different things to
technically
form the
metal
metal.
would come first
Metal?
because it was like created by the earth itself.
Yeah, so why would we need a wheel? I'm gonna ask somebody else besides Jessica. Jessica likes to answer questions, but somebody else give me an answer. Why do we need a wheel? To move things. So if we're moving things, we're moving big things, right? Heavy things, like plants and vegetables and things that we would harvest. What would you harvest those things with?
Oh, some tool of some kind. Okay.
Yeah,
Or-
metal tools, exactly. So metal came first. We know this. We know this. Donald Trump said something the other day about walls coming before wheels, or wheels coming before walls, or whatever. It's the exact opposite. It was walls that came first. Wheels, we didn't really have a need for wheels until we started to trade with other societies, until we had cultivated society to the point where there was a need for wheels. Because if you're a nomadic society, you're basically going to carry everything on your back, or you're going to have livestock or whatever carry the stuff for you. So you don't really need wheels, but when you're starting to transport a lot of stuff that can't be transportable through carrying it, like fruits and vegetables, then you need wheels. So we know this. And what ended up happening was that man started to move away from this culture of following the animals around to chase after them to supply themselves with food and vegetable, and started to realize that if they captured the animals, if they could fence the animals, then they could start to make babies with those animals, and they could have more of the animals. So they could have a plentiful supply, and they didn't have to just keep on chasing the animals and not being sure if the animals were ever going to come back to that place again. They could hold the animals in one place, and that's what worked for them. They started to create this society, or this idea of clustering the animals in one location, keeping them there, raising them, feeding them, and then harvesting the animals as they needed to. And they could do the same thing with plants and vegetables. They didn't just have to go out and hope that Mother Nature was going to create fruits and vegetables for them. They could actually plant the fruits and vegetables themselves and make more vegetables. So once they started to realize that they could do this, then civilization changed, and they were able to start trading back and forth from one society to another. There might be one tribe that was really good at raising horses, and there was another tribe out there that had somehow figured out how to raise chickens, and they could trade back and forth with each other. Writing really became important when that kind of trading started to happen. And when societies grew to the point where it was no longer just 20 or 30 people in their tribes, but it started to grow into the hundreds. And when you start to have hundreds of people, again, people start to develop their own specializations. So within that tribe of hundreds, they might find that some folks were really good at one skill, making metal. Other folks really good at other things, like making carts. And those people started to trade back and forth with each other. But if the guy that was making metal, or the person that was raising chickens and creating eggs, if they didn't have their supplies in at that time, they had to do an IOU system or a barter system. And when things started to get really complex, that's when writing started to happen, because for the sake of writing, most of the earliest forms of writing that we have are actually lists of inventories. Of how much has been warehoused of one thing or another. And when they started to do that, then they needed to be able to make their writing portable. And that's what we started to see here when we get into this idea of substrates. Now, we talked about clay, we talked about wood, we talked about dirt, we talked about all kinds of ways of keeping, writing things down. Papyrus was really a beneficial kind of substrate. Why? Why was it superior to those other kinds of substrates?
Lighter?
Very good. It was lighter. It was lightweight. It was the weight of a sheet of paper. So you could carry it around, and it was very, very portable. Think about carrying around clay tablets with you all the time. That would be really heavy. Most of the times, those folks that were doing the clay tablets, they kept them as wet clay tablets, and so they would write things out. And only the ones that they felt that they really needed to hold on to would they save those ones. The rest of them they would smear over, and then they would rewrite over top of the surface of them. But so that a lot of those clay tablets were lost just because they weren't permanent. They were just meant to take notations and so on. But when they started to need things for better record keeping and more permanence, and clay of course will break, papyrus seemed to work in that market. Anybody know how papyrus is made? Your name is Anthony. Anthony, do you know how papyrus is made?
Oh, it was made from those plants that you showed up here. Was it bamboo? No, not bamboo.
It's actually called papyrus. It's the name of those
yeah.
plants. And
So yeah, papyrus.
so papyrus is. So what do they do with these plants?
They seem to be like harvesting them. It looks like, and turning them into like pieces of wood, as you can see up there. I guess.
Okay, let's see if we can do somebody else. Anybody else? Jessica keeps on doing this, so go ahead, Jessica, get it out.
They dry the plants and then they weave the plants together to form paper-like substance.
They didn't dry the plants. They worked with them when they were still green, when they were still raw. Yeah. And Adam.
I actually took a class in paper mail. I was like a kid at the art museum. It's like It almost says consistency paper mache, I want to say.
Yeah, that's paper making, not
Uh-huh.
to be confused with papyrus.
Oh, 'cause it's,
Papyrus
okay,
is
figured
a
cotton.
different-
Okay.
It's
alright.
sort of the same thing, but not quite the same thing. All right, so since we're not clear on how papyrus is made, the folks that developed this were the Egyptians that were living in the Nile. And this plant grows specifically along the Nile River. No other place in the world grows papyrus plants. So they had this kind of monopoly going on this particular plant. It was unique because they hadn't quite figured out how to make paper in any other way than this. So otherwise, they were using cloth, they were using leather, they were using bamboo, they were using wood, they were using stone tablets, but they didn't really have anything. Papyrus was really the predecessor to what we know as paper. And in fact, the word paper comes from the word papyrus. In any case, they would take these plants, and the plants were really tall. They'd grow to anywhere from 6 to 12 feet tall. And they would cut them down and then split them into lengthwise segments. So they're really long segments. And while the plant itself would peel apart and have layer upon layer upon layer inside of the plant. So like an onion. So imagine an onion being cut in half, and if you could take those rings of the onion and flatten them down, that's what the insides of the papyrus would look like. I would take those, they would flatten them down, and then they would crisscross them or weave them together. Now, if you're working with a wet plant, anybody here ever taken apart a dandelion or another plant and just played with it? What happens to your hands?
Yeah.
Anybody played with
They get
dandelion? They get sticky. Right. Aloe's a good example. It's sticky inside. The plant fibers, the plant residue inside is pulpy. It's wet. So if you take a plant in its natural state and you start to weave it together in its wet state, what do you think is going to happen?
Hands get sticky.
The material starts to get sticky. It becomes like glue. And then if you take that and go even further and take a stone and you start pummeling that plant, especially if it's in a whirlwind form, and you start to pummel that plant and then let it dry, then it's like glue that's stuck to itself. So plant fibers with glue that are all kind of stuck together, and it becomes the solid surface. And then after all of that is done, once it's dried out in this flattened form, you can powder it and you can write over the surface of it. So this worked really, really nicely for those folks that were looking for a portable method of writing. And of course, the Egyptians used this for almost all of their writing, and they sold it to other places, other parts of the world, like the Romans and the Greeks and the Minoans and all these other cultures that had come along. And that's why we have, if we go backwards in historical movies or whatever, we see them rolling things up. It's the papyrus that they're rolling up. Because it worked very nicely. The scrolls themselves, the paper, or this new substrate that they made, worked very nicely in rolled form. It did not work so well when it was bent, when it was folded in half. When it was folded in half, it had a tendency to crumble. So that's why they were always rolling it up, because it would hold together as a rolled up version. But it's kind of like taking a leaf, a dried leaf. You can slowly roll that leaf up and it will still hold its shape, but if you take a dried leaf and you fold it in half, it crumbles into pieces. It's the same kind of concept here. Now, the problem with this was, again, the Egyptians had this monopoly going with this papyrus because they were the only ones that had access to papyrus, and in fact, they knew that nobody else had figured out how to make a substrate that was as lightweight as what papyrus was, except for cloth. Cloth could be written on as well. But they held on to this monopoly, and they knew that, and there were a lot of other cultures that came along and got really mad at them because they kept on hiking their prices up on papyrus. So they had to invent other methods of substrate. Anybody know other substrate surfaces that they could use? Do you think?
Rice paper.
Rice paper, yes, that came along around 105 AD, but that wasn't. This is 13,000 or 1300 BC. What do
I
you think?
forget what it's called, but it's like sheepskin.
Mhm.
They stretch out. Yeah,
Parchment. Parchment and vellum. So parchment is made from the skin of an animal, and supposedly vellum is made from the internal organs of an animal, which is kind of gross way of thinking. But what they would do is they would take the animal skin and they would start to, like when you're making leather, they would stretch it out, and they would, in this particular case, they would shave off all the hair off of the surface of the animal skin itself, and then they would continue to stretch it and stretch it and stretch it until it got so thin that you could practically see through it. And then they would actually sand it down to the point where it was very, very smooth, and that became parchment. Vellum was the same story. We no longer do parchment and vellum in this way, thank goodness. We make paper, and you might actually find paper out there that claims that it's parchment paper or vellum paper. What they're talking about is the texture is like parchment or like vellum. It's not really made out of animal skins or animal innards anymore. And so to this day, we still hold on to that terminology, but they're often referring to this kind of modeling color that you see that's going on here when they're talking about that surface. The parchment papers that we talk about usually have the same texture as what that real parchment looks like. But in any case, this was another method of substrates that came along at this around 1000 BC, and it was invented by the Romans. And they used, Romans and Greeks, they invented it to try to fight against that monopoly that the Egyptians had going on. You'd think that this would be an easy solution, but actually it was pretty expensive to do this too. So even though this came along as a method for substrates, it wasn't the only method that was out there. There were still people that were doing things like writing on wood. And in the Far East, when we get to China, they were actually creating substrates out of bamboo, which is very, very plentiful. It's a wood that grows very fast. It also grows in long pieces, and as far as wood goes, it's a very lightweight wood. It grows as hollowed shapes, or it can be dried out to become hollowed shapes, and you can cut it into long slats like this, and then you can piece the pieces together. This worked nicely for the Chinese writing system because they used what we call logograms in the way that they do their writing. But even still, if you have a lot of these, it still becomes very heavy to carry this around. So the idea of using bamboo books worked somewhat, but they were still in that search that for an inexpensive form of paper. It was the invention of paper itself that really changed all this. Came around 105 AD, and it could be made very, very cheaply. And it was also pliable enough that it could be bent and folded, which is one of the things that papyrus did not have going for it. Now, Adam started to talk about before how paper was made when you did it
yeah, it's like it's a Cleveland Art Museum. Yeah, and I was like, yeah.
Can you
project.
describe what that process was?
Yeah, my memory's a little foggy, but I remember it was sort of like strips. I can't remember what they were made out of. They kind of, that's why I said sort of paper mache. It was like a plaster or something that they used to kind of bring it together, and it hardened. I so long ago.
Okay, all right. Anybody else here ever done any kind of paper making, or think they know how paper making is done? Okay. Go ahead, Jessica. I need to see if I can get other people to ask questions, to answer questions. Go ahead, Jessica.
I've watched a documentary about it. Basically, they put a whole bunch of pulp into a pool, and then they put screens in the pool and bring it up.
Yep.
And they do it multiple times depending on how thick they want the paper.
Right.
And they have natural glues in the water itself, so that way when it dries naturally, it'll become a large sheet of paper.
Yeah, the glues are not glues themselves. It's actually that same pulpy stuff that we were talking about before with the papyrus. So what they do is, the difference between this and papyrus is the papyrus is still using the plant stems, the plant itself, as part of the overall weaving, or how the form of the substrate. In paper making, what they're doing is they're taking the whole plant, grinding it down into a fine, sawdust. So anybody here ever encountered wet plants? before that have started to rot and mold, what's that like? What's the texture of that like? It's kind of awful, but it's squishy. Yeah, it's really squishy. So imagine that you have a whole vat full of that stuff, a whole tank or a bucket that's filled with water and plants that are decomposing. The plant will naturally decompose. It breaks apart to the point where you can't even see the plant anymore. It just becomes this soppy kind of goop, right? Really horrible. But especially if it's something like sawdust or whatever, it becomes kind of this mush, this gluey stuff. But if you take that and you pour it over a screen, a really fine mesh screen, and then you start to shake that screen to get the water to come out of it, it leaves those plant fibers, those microscopic plant fibers behind. And they start to layer one on top of each other, plant fiber, plant fiber, plant fiber. As the water drips out of it, the plant fibers are left behind. So think about this from a microscopic level, but to just keep on building it, building it, building it, until you start to build up layers of tissue that become paper. So the more you put in there and the more you shake out, the more it becomes paper. Part of the reason why you're shaking it is so that it will all level out. Like when you make a cake and you have to shake it to get it to level out so it doesn't have, you don't have a lopsided cake in the oven. You want a nice even space. Well, that's the same thing with this. But you're also shaking it so that you can get the water to drain out. And then once they have enough of it built out, they'll take that entire screen and they'll flip it over and let it dry out. And then as it dries out, it all kind of glues itself together and becomes paper. And at first, when they first did this, they found that it was very, very crude. But as time went on, they started experimenting with different kinds of materials, including rice. And they found that different kinds of materials would create different kinds of papers. And so they, again, people rejected it when it first became available, but over time they kept on refining and refining until they got paper to the quality that we have today. This trade of paper was initially started, again, in China, which is nowhere near Western culture, which is what we consider Europe. So there's an entire continent that divides those spaces between each other. And it had to somehow make its way from China to the Western cultures. And that was done through the silk routes or silk roads, essentially going through the mountains and into the Middle East, and from the Middle East into the Western culture. It took a couple of hundred years for this transition to move from China into the Middle East. But by about 568, we see that the Middle Easterners are using paper as a substrate, and from there, trade continued into the Mediterranean, and from there into all of Western Europe. So we know that happened. We could give the Chinese a lot of credit for other innovations as well, including the beginnings of what we would call printing. Here we have an image. It's actually a very beautiful image that's drawn onto paper itself, and it is showing a couple of different kinds of goats here. But the thing that's really interesting to us is not so much the images of the goats or the writing that's here, but these things that are showing up all over this image. What do you think those are about?
Okay, is this what dialect? I guess might be the first question.
Chinese.
No, I mean like Cantonese or Mandarin or.
I don't even know. It's
Okay, never mind.
one dynasty, so whatever they were speaking back in that dynasty era, yes.
Some sort of like trademark to show where it came from?
That's a good guess.
Watermark.
A watermark, okay. Anybody else? A stamp?
One means goat, one means sheep or something.
No. Yeah, and can you enlighten us? Can you tell us what these things are called?
Name mark.
Yes, they're called chops, and they're a marker for names. A chop. They're a marker for names. So you're right in saying that they're a stamp, but they're not stamping things to say goat or whatever. I don't know what this is actually saying. I cannot read Chinese, but I know that this is some kind of identification over here, but these were actually kind of important because they denoted who owned this piece of art. And they used this over and over, so you can see how many different people had owned this piece of art over the course of time, because each one of this is a different mark. That's their symbols for a person's name. Kind of the same way that we have rubber stamps today. That's the same way that chops were, except in China they would make them out of ivory, and you had some very elaborate ones. Again, they were representative of family names or of a person. In any case, the idea for them is not new. We've seen them in other cultures before, the idea of this stamp. So if we go back to thousands of years before that, to a culture called the Hittites, when they were still working in clay tablets, they were taking clay and they were stamping a mark into it to denote ownership. This goes back to the times when man was becoming less nomadic and starting to develop cultures. They would take these marks like this, and they would put them on the things of what they owned. So if they had a house, they would put a stamp like that over their house so people could see, this is my house. If they had cows or sheep, they would have one of these hanging around the necks of their animals to show, this is my sheep, not your sheep, this is my sheep, and so on. Do you have a question or comment to make? No? So this idea of stamping had existed for a long time. The Chinese were the first ones, though, to actually put it onto paper and to make it denote, again, the idea of names there. The other thing that we attribute the Chinese, so part of what printing is and the way that printing has worked comes from this idea of the rubber stamp, of casting into a piece of paper and imprint onto a piece of paper. The other idea that we know that came from the Chinese were something called rubbings. So anybody here know what a rubbing is or seen a rubbing being done before? What's a rubbing?
Isn't it when you're taking something onto an elevated surface, so it's not just flat, but like the characters, whatever would come out, and then you are, whether it's ink or ash or crayon, sort of rubbing over it, and then because it's a 3D surface, those the elevated elements pop out.
Very good, very good. So how many of you guys been to Washington, D.C.? Been to the Vietnam Memorial? Seen people standing there with a piece of tracing paper over somebody's name and doing basically a rubbing, what Peter just described for us. So you take a piece of paper, and it doesn't have to be tissue paper, it can be any kind of paper, just as long as it's pliable enough that you can, when you press on it, you can start to see the thing that's underneath it start to come through. So if you take that crayon or a piece of charcoal or whatever, even pencil, and rub it over top of a surface that's incised, it will leave behind a rubbing. And the thing that's really cool about this that kind of fits into the idea of printing is that once you have that charcoal image, you could actually take that charcoal image, put it to another piece of paper, and it will offset onto that piece of paper. And it will offset backwards, but that idea of taking one thing that's got a material that will offset, using that to offset is where the idea of printing started to come from. People started to put these ideas together. The story behind this is that around 165 AD, the emperor that was in China at this time realized, in one province of China, realized that the classic Confucian stories were being lost, that people were telling them in different ways. Anybody here ever played the game telephone?
Yeah.
You know, you whisper in your ear at the time. If I whispered something into your ear and then you passed it on, by the time I get down here to Liz, the message would be completely obliterated. And that's just because we hear things differently, or we pass on information differently from person to person to person. And that's what was happening with these Confucian tales. People were starting to tell the stories, but they weren't telling them the same way twice. And he felt very upset because the information was being confused, it was changing. So he demanded that the stories be literally carved into stone, into what's called stelas, which are stone tablets, and they can be as tall as like 5 feet, 6 feet tall. He literally had the stories carved into stones, and then in order to make sure that people were telling the story appropriately, he would have them do rubbings of those stones so that they could read those rubbings as to what the story was, so that the story stayed consistent, it stayed solid, and it was passed on from generation to generation exactly the same way. So this was a really important part of record keeping. Those books themselves, the stela, took up acres of land, but the pieces of paper that they were doing this on were very lightweight, and you could fill it into small booklets. So it's very portable that way, which is really cool also. Originally, when they started to put these ideas together of not just doing the stone tablets, but actually of having wood that they could carve out of and doing rubbings on, or even taking those wood carvings that they were doing and putting ink over the top of the surface and imprinting them into things, that really caught on. But they were originally just doing them for fabric making. Somehow they didn't put together the idea of doing words onto these wood blocks. So I'll pass this around so people can see. This is what we call wood block printing or relief printing. It wasn't until almost 600 years later, in 770 AD, that somebody came up with the idea of actually taking one of those pieces of wood and carving words into the wood itself and imprinting them over and over again. These are a series of Buddhist charms that were developed, basically sent out by the Buddhist priests or Buddhist monks at that time, and placed into small pagodas to ward off an epidemic of, I'm not sure what illness it was, probably some kind of pox that was going on around at that time. And they placed them into these small pagodas as a means of warding off the evil that was going on. But they were imprinting these over and over and over again by the thousands, and placing them in pagodas throughout the land of China to ward off this evil. And once they started there, then they started to realize, oh, we could start to print lots and lots of stuff. So let's just kind of go over the topic of relief printing, because what that wood block is right there, and what this rubber stamp is here, this is all relief printing. So when we think about relief printing, we're thinking about having some kind of a surface that you carve out of. Again, anybody here ever done like potato prints or apple prints back in grade school?
Yeah.
I did the actual like plastic or the rubber.
Or even linoleum prints? Yes. Okay, that's all called relief printing. It's the same thing. The process is the same, where you take a surface, a flat surface, and you're carving out of it, and then once you've got that carved area done, then you're applying ink to all of those raised surfaces. Once you have the ink on those raised surfaces, you can put a piece of paper over top of it, put a lot of pressure down, and when you pull it away, you have the image. This is very simple. This is the most rudimentary kind of printing that we have, but it's had staying power for a very long time. And so relief printing is what this method is called, and it's anytime when you have a raised surface and you're applying ink to that raised surface. Getting back to the Chinese, once they started to realize that the idea of carving out a piece of wood with all the words in it was successful for them, they started to realize, well, what happens if we cut those words apart? If we took each one of those figures and we put them together as separate blocks, we could move them around. We could form whole different concepts. So it's not like you're locked into one image like you are with one whole piece of wood, but you have small little pieces that you can move around, and you can start to change out the meanings and the messages that are being done. And that's exactly what they did. They did this with each one of these symbols carved into a small wooden square. Now, this was really successful for the Chinese because the Chinese language is made up of something called logograms. So we had pictograms, we had ideograms. What's a logogram?
It's like a symbol or some sort of object was made from, like, if I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like 4 different strokes or something to count in a combination of how you arrange them. I'm kind of grasping at straws here,
Okay,
but it
somebody
read.
else wanna help him? What's a logogram?
It's like a symbol, instead of like individual letters the way we have, it's like a symbol that represents a particular word.
So, of course, corporations are built on the idea of logos,
Okay.
the shortened,
Got it.
shortened version of what a logogram is. But a logogram actually ultimately represents a word itself. So when we see a logogram, we come to understand that it means a word. Can anybody think of a logogram?
Like a deer sign.
No, that's a pictogram.
Okay, thank you.
It's still an abstract. It doesn't look like the thing it is, but
A
it's
Nike
still.
symbol,
What is it?
a Nike check.
Yeah, that's kind of a logo. What is?
McDonald's sign.
A dollar sign. Perfect. Exactly. A dollar sign. So if we, or did you say McDonald's? Because McDonald's is a logo, but a dollar sign. Where's my markers? If you said a dollar sign, you're exactly right. And actually a logo. The McDonald's sign is also a logogram, except that it's really just a logo. But here's an example of a logogram. That's a logogram. And of course the other way around. A set sign here, ampersand, exclamation point. These are things that do not look like the thing that they're representing, but we automatically have a word or a name for them. Yes?
Are like music notes considered? Oh, okay.
Yep, so we know those as to be logograms also. Anybody else?
This is more of a question. What, like, I get that it often has stop written on it, but like, we're made to associate a red hexagon with stop. Would that be a pictogram or logo?
That becomes a connotation of it's a symbol, but it's a connotation, and I have to think about whether or not that's a logogram or a pictogram. That is a logogram, stands for the word no. So when we see something and it means a word to us, even though it doesn't necessarily look like the thing it is, so a stop is not inconceivable, it's kind of an abstract thought itself, but it could be that it's a logogram.
Or also the explosion
Probably,
symbol. or-
Yeah.
Would numbers do that as well?
Well, no, because they've come to represent well, I guess they could be.
I mean, when you think of 3, you think of the word 3. And when you think of 1.
I don't know. I think we're really starting to get into connotation. So it's, I can't say for positive sure, but I think you guys get the idea, the gist of this. The idea that we have a symbol that stands for something else. And when we put that into application here, what that means is that each one of these symbols comes to represent a word or maybe even an entire sentence, which is crazy for us because we don't have that in the United States or in the Western culture. We don't necessarily have logograms that stand for an entire sentence, unless we think about logos themselves. But each one of these symbols here comes to represent an entire thought unto itself. So if you start to think about that in broader terms, that means that instead of saying, I'm trying to see if I know any of these symbols here. I don't know any of these symbols here, but if you come to recognize that one of these symbols stands for man, right? If we have a symbol here that stands for man, when we write that, can I call upon you to write the symbol for man?
Me? Or him?
Yeah. Can you write the symbol for man? It's like a triangle, right? It's like that. Is that right? Or how do you write it?
Oh.
Yeah, how do you write it? How do you write the symbol? Can you do it? I'm sorry, I put you on the spot, but just write us a symbol, one symbol, man, tree, I don't care. Can you write the symbol? Yeah. Write the symbol for, no, in Chinese. In Chinese figures, can you write the symbol for man?
Man?
Man. Okay, all right, we'll go with that. Is this the word man?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, all right, so what she's created, all right, thank you. What she's created is one figure, that if you carve out this one figure, it is, stands for an entire word. We have 3 characters that we have to use in order to create that word in Western culture, right? and it can be even more complex. That one's a really more complex than what I'm used to seeing. But for some of these, like if we look at that one right there, or that one right there, or that symbol right there, they stand for whole words by themselves, but they're just a couple of lines. And as a character itself, it would be contained in one simple block, like this, when they are working, when they're creating these as individual letter forms. Whereas if we're doing this as movable elements, we would have 3 of them. So 1 versus 3 wins in this particular case because it's simpler, it's easier. If you have one of those instead of 3 of them, then it's easier to construct. So if we have each one of these is one block instead of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many characters that we need to build up a word, you can see that you can contain a lot of thoughts in a short amount of space. It's efficient, right? It's efficient. It's like writing everything in emoticons, right? If we wrote everything in emojis, it would be a lot simpler than writing whole words out. You can say a lot in a very small amount of space. And so this worked very nicely for them in the Chinese language system because they could contain a lot of words in a very small, or a lot of thoughts in a very small amount of space. They could produce things in much faster amounts, and because they were done to look like handwriting, to look like calligraphy, it wasn't necessary that they had to be exactly precise in how they write those letter forms. So they could carve these out of wood. They could do them at larger sizes, and they could still maintain legibility because they could produce a lot more onto a sheet of paper, right? Get that? There were problems, though, in this system. I'll just point out one of them. The Chinese language system is comprised of thousands, if not thousands, of letter forms. And so in order to sort this out, if you don't have a phonetic writing system, how do you sort those out? In the Western culture, we sort out through this little song that we learned way back in kindergarten. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's how we sort our numbers out. That's how we learn the characters in our writing system. Chinese don't have that. The Chinese have words that sound like another word. And so in their sorting system, they would sort things in revolving type cases where they would rhyme the words to each other. So when we think about words that rhyme with each other, we can talk about blue and true and you and view and moo and crew, and we can start to rhyme those words out, and that's how they sorted them out. So think about that sometime. If you're trying to find those letters, you have to go to, okay, here's the case where all the ooh sounds are at, and I'm gonna have to go through this entire turntable before I can find those letter forms. But again, they didn't need as many of them as what we do need. It's still complex because according to the King Shai Dictionary, there's approximately 47,000 words in the Chinese language system. For most people, they consider Chinese literacy for the average citizen to be a knowledge of about 4,000 to 5,000 words. Still a lot of words to have to sort through. Scholars will know more than that, but ultimately 4,000 to 5,000 characters that they have to sort through versus the 26 characters in the Western culture of the alphabet, right? So there's big difference between that. And that 26 characters, even though we would think that makes the phonetic writing system, meaning the sounding writing system that we have here, superior, it doesn't necessarily, because it means that we have to have more of those characters. More of the A's, more of the B's, more of the C's, in order to make those 3 characters that stand for man versus the 1 character for Chinese language, right? Guys get it? For the logogram that they're creating. Which became a reason why Western culture, even though trade existed between China and the West, took a long time, but they had this trade. Western culture started to see printing. They started to understand printing. They started to understand relief and how to do this. They couldn't figure out a way to make creation of those letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G in multiples efficiently and effective, especially in the way that we write. We don't write great big characters that are a half an inch tall. Most of us write much, much smaller than that. And so our characters are much more detailed in tiny amounts of space. Anybody here ever done any kind of carving at all on wood? Jessica and Sage? So what do you know about carving small, intricate little things with into wood?
It's hard.
It's very hard. You have to have very specialized tiny little tools to get, just to get a tiny little curve, because the wood has places where it's soft and the wood has places where it's hard, and so you're trying to carve out, you're trying to make sure that everything is at the same distance away. If you're trying to create letter forms, you're trying to create this, but you're trying to do it in miniature at about 1/10 of the size that it is here. This amount of intricacy. Imagine the fine tools that you need to do. Now imagine that you have to do that 1,000 times over, just to get enough letters together in order to create whole comprehensive thoughts. That's daunting, and that's what kept Western culture from developing this idea of movable type like the Chinese had. Chinese had it way before Western culture did. Westerners did not have movable type. They had woodblock printing, they had relief printing, they did not have the idea of movable type. Now you can see here that there are some letters on this playing card that was popular around 1400 BC, or I'm sorry, AD, 1400 AD. They were doing things that were out of woodblock printing. But these letters were individually carved, and you notice that there aren't that many of them. There's just a few of them. And that's because if you can imagine trying to carve all of this and you screw up, you make a mistake, and you slice off the top of the letter T or lose a stem from that wood, you can't put it back. It's carved, it's gone. You can't make that letter into something different or change the entire word, because that letter is intrinsic to the whole message. So you have to be really, really careful whenever you're carving out words. So they used it very, very small amounts of words that they would use into writing surfaces. That changed thanks to this handsome devil, Johann Gutenberg. Johann Gutenberg. He was named by Time magazine as the man of the millennium in the January 1st, 2000 issue of their publication. Time magazine named him the man of the millennium. What does that mean? What's a millennium?
1,000 years.
1,000 years. If you're named the man of 1,000 years, not just the man of the year, not just the man of the decade, not just the man of the century, but the man of the last 1,000 years, that means that you did something pretty astounding. What did he do?
Printing press, movable type, dot distribution.
Okay, yeah. Jessica, were you going to say something?
I don't know for 100% certainty because he made the printing press, not the printing press. The printing press.
Okay, Kelly?
He combined the printing press, oil-based inks, and cast metal type to publish books.
Good. Is that one of your questions of the day?
That's my notes.
Okay, good. Yeah, he created a lot of people think that he created the printing press. They put this picture in their head as to what he did, created the printing press. And that's, really a thought-provoking thing to say that he did that, but he didn't. He didn't create the printing press. The printing press existed long before this. It wasn't called the printing press. It was called a wine press. Making wine, but this device existed long before Gutenberg came along. So he didn't invent this machine. So instead, what he created was what we call movable type, movable metal type. And that's really the thing that was what made him exceptional. He made it out of metal. And up until this point, all printing that had been done was done with wood. Metal was superior in this. Why is metal superior?
It doesn't work.
Good. Yes, it doesn't work. What else?
It lasts longer and doesn't absorb the ink.
Okay. What else? Yes.
Material properties. You can, I don't think they had to worry about corrosion back then, but
Yeah.
the corrosion resistance and whatever all that.
What else?
If you made a mistake, you could melt down the metal again.
Good. Yeah. Anything else? Think about jewelry and how small jewelry is.
Like different sizes.
You can make it really small. Exactly. You can make really tiny little pieces, and you could hold the constraints of it. So what he ended up doing was, and here's the even unsexier version of what he did. He didn't just make movable metal type. He actually created the alloys to make movable metal type. So it's really kind of down to the nitty gritty of what technically what he did. He was a metallurgist. He figured out how to mold metal so that it could be used for typesetting purposes. Really kind of a dull way of saying it. That's why people say, oh, he invented printing. He didn't invent printing. He invented the metal alloys to make printing possible. But all the same, it was a pretty incredible thing that he did. So the story of Gutenberg was that he was a jewelsmith. That was his trade. So he was working with metals all the time anyhow, really good at it. And so he could do fine little details. He had those tools that he could carve things and make molds for jewelry making. So think about chains, and think about intricate little pieces of jewelry. I mean, we're talking about pretty sophisticated, tiny little pieces of things, and he was very good at it. So he knew how to do this. He also knew how, the materials that he used for pouring gold into something else and then having to offset it and pour it out and then mold it from there further. So he was already into this. But he, like many others, was interested in this idea of typesetting, of actually printing. Gutenberg, and this is part of the problem with that 2000 proclamation by Time magazine saying that he was the man of the millennium. Nobody is really sure if Gutenberg was the one that invented this idea of movable metal type. Nobody's really positively sure. And that's because there are a lot of other people that were doing the same thing throughout Europe. And if you go into any town in Europe, you're probably going to find a statue erected someplace to the person that invented printing in that particular town, because everybody was taking claim for it. The idea, once it got out there, then everybody was claiming that they invented it and started to use it. But it's pretty much believed that Gutenberg was the guy that did this. So what he did was he created something called a punch, this right here. This is a punch, and again, like in jewelry making, you have a master. The punch is the master. This punch is carved out of stone, and it's carved intricately, so it's like out of granite, a very hard stone. The trick here is when you put something that's really a hard material like stone, and you put it into hot metal, then that stone could shatter, could break into lots of little pieces, because what it ends up happening is you have this punch, and then you have to create a matrix for it. So you create this punch, you punch it into something, and then that matrix becomes the template for all the pieces that start to get molded outward from there. So we have this positive form, and we only have to have one of them. This is the trick. Have one of these, you can make one of these, and from that you can make thousands of these. So once he had developed this, he needed to get it to go to this point. This is the easy part. Carving this letter form was easy. Getting it to punch into that matrix, that was the hard part, because he knew that metal, if it was hot enough, would shatter that punch, that original punch. So it had to be a cool enough temperature that it could hold up to the punch itself could hold up to the heat of that matrix. That meant that you had to treat it somehow, that you had to have a way to treat this so that once it had that image pressed into it, that you could harden it to the point where you could start to pour more metal into it and have create this cast for thousands and thousands of them. And when you did that, you had to make sure that when you were treating this, that it wasn't making the letter forms expand or contract or become something completely different from each other. So again, it's a really kind of labor-intensive, boring process that most of us would kill ourselves if we actually had to do it, because it's so labor-intensive and so long in trying to figure it out. But it all comes down to chemical levels and properties. Again, I won't go into the reasons why things happen. It's complex. regardless of that, he developed this. But it took long years for him to do that, and in order to do that, he actually had to borrow money in order to make it happen. And once he had these letter forms figured out, he realized that the standard ink that you would use for printing like this didn't work. So he ended up spending another couple of years to try to figure out how to make that ink so it would hold up onto these letter surfaces that were itty-bitty tiny, that were put together that the ink wouldn't slide off of the edges. And then once he had that, then he could develop this concept of printing, of the movable letter form type. We're going to stop right there today because we've run out of time. Are there any questions? Okay. I think that's enough for right now. Be prepared on Wednesday's class next week. Remember, no class on Monday. Be prepared on Wednesday's class to have question of the day. One other thing. I've placed in our Blackboard site a place to share information. So if anybody comes across an article that they think is interesting, if somebody's videotaping
Yeah, I try to get up to it. I put on my, I sent her my link to my YouTube page, so I can put that up
If
there.
anybody's videotaping the lectures and they want to share them with the class, they can drop them into there. If anybody needs notes, they can send a note, or if they want to share their notes with everybody else so others can have access to them, that's great. But I've just made a place available for people to drop things if they want to share them with the rest of the class. Okay? All right, thanks guys. I'll see you.